Immigrants from China. What was a piece of media you didn't know was censored until you actually left China? Chinese immigrants here. My family has political ties, so I heard more propaganda than usual. It's common for people to join the Communist Party to get ahead in life. Connections are pretty important. What surprised me the most was that people outside China seemed to hate or dislike China so much. Inside the country, the focus of our education was less about censorship, but more about propaganda, aka China is best place ever. All 5,000 plus years of beautiful art and heroes, etc. That's why so many Chinese people will defend China so passionately and ignore any contradictory facts. No need for censorship because people were already non-receptive to any bad things said about their dear motherland. Anyway, that's why it's extra shocking to hear people hate on a place that felt like the best. Even knowing all the facts now, most Chinese people will only appear to be enlightened, to fit in and not make trouble or cause people to judge them. Secretly, they remain loyal to China. It's like this. Imagine if you had a great childhood, subjectively, and your mom loved you and you loved her. Then imagine some strangers present concrete evidence that your mom is a terrible person and did terrible things. Can you still hate her? Agree with the strangers? Just toss away all the good memories? This is my perspective based on personal experiences. Due to the geographic and population size of China, you'll see a huge variety in the stories people tell. My family is upper middle class, doctors, engineers, professors, a few local government officials, so they're fairly educated living in the capital of China, Beijing. A farmer or those overnight Chinese millionaires will have very different views. So why immigrate? Because engineers get paid a lot in Silicon Valley and my parents went to California on vacation and love the weather there. Other common reasons, too much pollution or not enough nature or there's too much competition in school for their kids, problems of overpopulated cities. Political refugees or people escaping from poverty immigrate for better lives, aka the American dream. When do Chinese people learn the truth? Largely depends on the family, the person, and your location. Curious teenagers in major cities will start to question things and vault over the firewall. But if you have any family in the military or you have zero interest in politics or history, like my cousins who just play games on their phones every day, or you're a rural factory worker, you'll probably never know the truth. Were or are people in China happy? Yeah, people are adaptive and most have no points of comparison. My parents lived through periods of intense communism where they barely had enough to eat. And there's much more state control and extreme dystopian measures than today. But still, they enjoyed that time. For example, nobody could be fired from their jobs. They had absolute job security and assigned jobs, no stress at work. Most people were equally poor and happy. Now everyone's standard of living is going up, but new problems arose. Corruption, bribery, jealousy, overconsumption, unemployment, wealth gaps, dangerous business practices, competing with neighbors who have fancier cars or children going to the Ivy League. Now life is really stressful, again, based on their personal experiences. Everyone has their own lenses to see the world. Yeah, that's a pretty good way of putting it. I can see how hard it could be or would be to change that kind of system when most people are proud of what they already have. Story 2. Born and raised in a large city in China, I immigrated here in 2007. I already knew about the Tiananmen Square accident as my mom's cousins were among the students and my mom's ex-BF were among the soldiers when they were all young. I already heard about the harvesting story of the cult members, but it was some regional thing that's not the norm. I knew people who had insights about the living conditions in the re-education camp where they hold the cult members in my city. At least it wasn't too bad in my city. It sounded like somewhere between a prison and a summer camp. I already knew people in Hong Kong hated China, only because I watched Japanese TV while I was traveling in Japan with my parents. Summer 1997, when the CCP got HK back to China from the UK. I already knew the CCP army surrenders in the Korean War had the choice to be released to Taiwan, and many of them chose so, only because my grandfather went and fought in combat during the entire war. I was a teenager who was a rebel and felt oppressed, so I did my fair part of research. Plus, I had the advantage of knowing people who participated in such historical events in person. But I doubt the majority of Chinese would care to learn as much as I did. Sometimes being ignorant and dumb is a blessing if you are stuck in a situation you can't change. What I did not know was how the CCP did little to nothing during World War II in order to preserve power, while the Nationalist Party gave everything to defend the country. Later, the CCP won the Civil War by brainwashing the uneducated majorities, then twisted the whole story totally to the opposite in history textbooks. and forced generations of people to believe the CCP was the legitimate ruler. The CCP even promoted the idea of having multiple political parties to avoid tyranny and corruption, up until they took over China and took a huge turn. Story 3. Not a lot of true immigrants in this post, but I am a genuine immigrant. First time answering Ask Reddit. I'm pretty excited. Hopefully my answer will not get buried in the comments. When I left China in the early 2000s, there wasn't much censorship on the internet, honestly. It's because the internet was still young and the CCP probably hasn't caught up with it yet. Most of the censorship is what is on the TV. The Tank Man video is censored. I first saw the video for the first time in 7th grade in America. Although it was my first time seeing the video, I immediately know what it is about because I vividly remember my family or people I knew talked about it. There wasn't a lot of hate when they were discussing it, maybe because they didn't protest. Mao was always praised as the greatest leader, blah blah blah, and the horrible things he has done weren't taught in the books. Though I have seen some small-time Chinese TV shows that euphemistically criticize what he has done. Their vision of the Pledge of Allegiance says to love the party, love the country, love the people. Notice how they say love the party first? Lol. Didn't question it when I was a kid why they put the love the party first part or even put it in there at all. Honestly, the best part of being an immigrant who speaks both languages is that it allows me to get both sides of view and allows me to hear both sides of the story. It allows me to be more unbiased. We love to say that in the US nothing is censored, freedom of speech, etc. Although things are not censored, the news is very biased. Look at Fox News. It can create such a large information gap between Americans, Democrats versus Republicans. Imagine what kind of gap it can create between people from two different countries. Things aren't censored in America, sure, but things aren't mentioned either. If things aren't mentioned, then people don't even know they exist. It is sort of like softcore censorship that we have here. The politicians do it very smartly. Sadly, once people fall into this information gap trap, it's so hard for them to get out. Look at the r/the Donald and r/Sino. They are the perfect example of it. Also, people from both sides were fed with a heavy dose of patriotism when they were growing up. Same trick, same thing, different country. And I sincerely hope people can actually open their eyes to realize the same trick, same thing, but different country part. Some people just can't accept that their country isn't flawless. Story 4. Immigrated to Canada when I was in high school. In social class, there are 4 pages in the textbook dedicated to China, with one of them focused on the Tiananmen Square incident. Went home and asked my dad about it. He was surprised I never heard about it somehow back in China, lol. Apparently, his friend was at the protest and said the situation is not as bad as how the media would have you believe. This is one of the reasons I remain skeptical on what really happened that day. I was also surprised to learn that communism is considered a bad ideology and comparable to fascism in certain contexts, and soon found out China is communist in name only with a bit more research. Apparently, Henry Norman Bethune is almost nobody here but was revered greatly in China. Also learned about how the issue of weapon control gathered sizable supporters on each side. Being from China, weapon ownership is a no-no, and I can see why the government wants to keep it that way. There are music videos that can be practically considered soft-core in China, played on public TV channels at prime time. LGBTQ rights almost never hit mainstream media in China. I was under the impression that it is much less common than it actually is. The Dalai Lama is well respected by a lot of people. In China, he is almost unanimously considered a traitor. Mao is considered an evil man, where in China his image ranges from the savior of the country to a flawed leader. The Korean War is essentially China versus UN for geopolitical reasons. In most Chinese media and literature, it was referred to as China versus USA for the cause of protecting the weak. North Korea is not just poor, it's a giant prison. Recreational substances are a thing, and you don't become a user and send to rehab the moment you consume it. Story 5. Chinese immigrant here. I moved to Canada starting at grade 3, so I guess there wasn't much to know to begin with. I learned about Tiananmen Square, Mao's escapades, etc., and when I went back to tell my friend about it, they revealed to me that they and almost every kid in China knows about it, but it doesn't do them very well to show it. As kids, we weren't pumped with a lot of propaganda for your family and being kind to elders, your typical moral compass that I would get during my schooling in China. We gather at the field every Monday to watch the flag raise and sing the anthem and do some morning exercises, eye exercises, and we clean and sweep and wipe our classrooms before we leave school. We would wear red ties around our necks, and that was about as close to communist practices as it got. After coming here, it's weird seeing how Westerners and their media viewed communism. It wasn't a big deal in my life to begin with, and everyone that I know in China is leading lives that aren't terribly different from others in Western countries. For years, I struggled to see how my life would be different either way. I got mad at people calling Chinese people commies, or even my HK and Taiwan classmates calling me a peasant and a lowlife. It made me believe that people were fearmongers and delusional because I've only known people from all over China who are kind, considerate, generous, and extremely hardworking to the point where they don't have time to be involved in doing stupid things. However, I only started to feel weird about my home country when I went back last time. AI face cameras meant the streets were very safe, but I couldn't access many things without a Chinese number, which required a Chinese ID. They got rid of a bunch of Visa terminals, so people like me are forced to use WeChat Pay, which I can't use now, and people in general feel way more on edge than ever before. Questions that I would have and be curious about, and they can't answer. Before, I remember there being so many Visa terminals, and it was easy for foreigners to spend money and have fun in China without worrying about anything. Chinese people can talk smack about the government regulations in public, but now I can't help but feel that China moved away from catering to the international people to now turning other cheek for some reason I can't work out. I feel something's going down, and I just don't want the Chinese people to be paying the big price for it in the end. I know, I personally don't think of the Chinese people as being communist. I definitely separate the Chinese people and the CCP and their actions. Story 6. Chinese here, not immigrant, just a foreign student, so here is another point of view. I started to use the internet frequently around the 2008 Beijing Olympics. At that time, Google is unbanned for 8 months in order to let foreigners use it without much trouble. I had no idea about GFW back then, so I was pretty shocked when Google was banned again, and I discovered the whole thing about GFW. At that time, VPN was fairly easy to find and use. Before I came to the US, Discord and Reddit were both safe in China. However, they were banned at some point during the last year, so when I was back to China last year during vacation, I was in shock again. Like, what? Just a chat software? What's the point of banning it? Then I heard news about NetEase working on a Discord copycat. Then I finally realized GFW is not about censorship, it's all about protecting the local businesses. Imagine what Baidu would look like without banning Google. Whenever a popular software or game is banned or heavily censored, a copycat in China is born, and eventually the copycat will overthrow the original one, drive them out of China completely, and even beat them up on international business. Here is a list I can think of right now. Google, Baidu, Twitter, Sina Weibo, Facebook, Renren, Instagram, Sina Lu Zhao, Discord, some Discord copies made by NetEase, they are still in development, Nico Nico, Bilibili, Steam, Tencent WeGame. Steam is not completely banned, but the Steam community, workshop, and friend list are all banned. In China, you have to add a new Steam friend in the Dota 2 client. Amazon, Taobao, PUBG Mobile, Tencent's Peace Elite, NetEase's Knife Out, Twitch, Douyu, Vine, TikTok, Line, WeChat, MSN, Tencent QQ. I said that GFW is all about protecting local business, but I didn't mean it has nothing to do with censorship. Maybe I shouldn't use exaggeration? Anyway, you get the idea. Bonus, my grandmother was born in a high-rank KMT officer family. She didn't retreat to Taiwan like many of her family members, but she had to throw all the jewelry and goodies in order to hide. I was once thinking about finding my missing relatives in Taiwan, but I have no idea where to start. If someone knows, please give me some suggestions. Story 7. Another guy here was not born in China, but both of my parents are Chinese. Just wanted to give some perspective about how the government can easily shape the minds of their people. I was born in America, and although my brother was born in China, he spent most of his life here too. As a result, we're both relatively liberal and not blind to a lot of the that China pulls. Anyways, while doing a project for my 9th grade history class on China in the 1900s, I decided to have a bit of fun by putting some whiskers and cat ears on Map Zedong and dub him Miao Zedong for an image in my slideshow. I like to make people laugh a bit, so I thought it was a funny thing I could just slip into my assignment. Somehow, my father caught wind of what I was doing in my project, and he immediately came to me and berated me on what I had done. He told me that I shouldn't tarnish Mao's name or image, and it was essentially a sin, and I would be cursed with misfortune for the rest of my life. The worst part was my father didn't even seem that angry at me. He seemed almost frightened. Since then, my family has become slightly more informed and disillusioned with the schemes of the Chinese government, and I've taken more of a neutral and open-minded stance to their affairs, which I am extremely happy about. As much as I appreciate China for its rich history, culture, and people, its government is nothing short of despicable in the amount of control they have over their own people, as well as American companies that they shouldn't have in the first place, is despicable and honestly downright scary. Story 8. Falun Gong Detention and Harvesting, Tiananmen Square Accident 1989. Personally, as a younger generation, my parents had no problem recollecting when I asked. Specific scenes from entertainment media. I left pretty early on, so it's pretty hard to tell what I would realize if it was censored or not had I stayed. Scenes from TV shows would probably have become non-existent in my mind forever, but there are internet euphemisms for large events like Tiananmen Square Accident 1989, so I may have realized that it was censored if I ended up frequenting the internet as much as I do now. That being said, I definitely would not know what the original Tankman picture looked like. I probably would never have heard about Falun Gong or their harvesting. I'm not aware of any internet euphemisms for it. From when I first heard about it to now, I've gone from it's probably entirely true to only a few as political prisoners to 1.3 million passed away from harvest is plausible, back to some moderate number between the two as political prisoners. The reason for this is that credibility and evidence is all over the place for this topic, and this is what my current level of research says is most plausible. The first time I heard about things going away in Xinjiang was in Canada in 2014, in a car with a few Chinese immigrant co-workers in their mid-lives. I could tell it would be censored in China, and I don't know how they got their information. They talked about the use of weapons, mowing down mobs, charging towards the weapons at night in order to avoid satellite imaging. Questionable details, but again, I don't know where they got their info from. Something that really grinds my gears is that Westerners sometimes act like they understand more about China than a Chinese because they have easy access to information which is censored in China. It's completely fair to be mad about China's influence affecting what your public companies say or promote. It's another thing entirely to rhetorically question the population like you know them better than them when you've never even set foot in the land, not to mention any appreciable knowledge of their history, let alone share it. Story 9. Immigrant here, moved to the US around 2012 and has been back and forth a bit. I guess the most shocking thing is how much people didn't like us. I guess for a while it felt really lonely due to how different it felt from the family and community-oriented the whole Chinese culture was. Back in China, it was all community-based and made you feel super good about being a Chinese, and everyone supported you and all that, made you feel proud of the place you came from. But the moment I stepped into the USA, it was just crushing. Though for the censorship, to be honest, everyone kind of knew about it, so everyone around my age had some kind of VPN. As an add-on, I also find it really funny how people in the US think of us. Sometimes it doesn't sound like we are human from what they say. You really think there isn't anyone who is talking bad about China in China? Well, people are the same everywhere. If there are people talking bad about the US in the US, there's going to be people talking bad about China in China. No one is really going to kick down your door 3 seconds after you posted China is ugly or something. Story 10. Chinese immigrant here, moved to Canada when I was 18. My family is comparatively well-educated and lived in a southern coastal city. We talked about history and politics pretty openly at home, so I got clued in by the CCP's lies pretty early on. In high school, we had to take a political science course, which has 4 modules: basic economics, civics, cultural theory, and philosophy. It was during the last module when it finally dawned on me that things really don't make sense in China. You see, obviously, we had to learn about Marxist materialism and how that's different or opposite from spiritualism. But it's the way the textbook just absolutely shits on religions that I find unacceptable. And some of my peers shared my opinion too. I mean, people who were actually reading Capital for leisure. That day, there was a huge debate between them and the teacher, who basically fumbled around for half an hour before declaring class dismissed. I'm an atheist myself. After reading up on the tenets and histories of religions, and enough Richard Dawkins, I'm comfortable with my position. But Dawkins and many other atheists like him don't feel it necessary to absolutely shit on religion. They criticize it, but also acknowledge its significant role that it's played in human society. In China, the them versus us mentality is extremely strong, since the CCP has been pushing this unification narrative for decades. And to somehow prove and strengthen their legitimacy to rule, they just shit on anything and everything that's different from the China they envision. Most Chinese people know next to nothing about religions other than a bit of Buddhism. They can't tell apart a Catholic and a Protestant. China's a big country, but the people there have small worlds. Story 11. My parents immigrated from China back in the 1990s. I went to school for 5 years in Shanghai and have gone back there every summer. I straight up never knew that Tibet was a place that the rest of the world recognized. I learned about it in middle school and was so confused because I had just known the region by a different name. and I thought the place was always just integrated into China. I'd never heard about Tiananmen Square until I came to the US. I did know, though, that the censors on the internet back in China would be extremely active on June 4th. Any mention of the date or related words would be censored on the online forums I used. Baidu was the main one. WeChat hadn't even come out back then. And while I knew back then that posts relating to the date were being deleted and censored, I never knew why until I learned about it in high school. It wasn't until recently that my grandma told me about the Cultural Revolution and how I have a distant relative that fled to Taiwan when the PRC was formed. She told me it was a family secret and a shame. My worldview changed a lot since I moved away from China and became more integrated in American society. I definitely was fed a lot of propaganda as a kid and was an avid defender of China and its ideals. When your formative years are spent there and all the media you consume is so strictly regulated and curated, of course you never learn to question it. And if you're enjoying the video and learning a thing or two so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 12. Born and raised in a Western European country, Chinese immigrant parents, studied China studies. My husband is also Chinese, came here as a teen. He did not know about the Tiananmen Square accident before coming here. Our parents and grandparents all know about World War II, the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, and the Tiananmen accident. Yes, they know that the CCP has done terrible things. I keep bringing it up to them and they don't deny it. But they also don't forget all the great things the CCP have done for the country. China was extremely poor for a long time. This was due to the decline of the Qing dynasty, all the Western countries that tried to colonize China, all the wars they fought with them in World War II. Don't forget that the people themselves at that time have chosen the CCP because they stand for the poor, which was like 99% of the population. The Democratic Party, which was in power, was corrupt and did nothing for the people and the country. Yes, the CCP had made devastating choices trying to enrich the country, but since the 80s, CCP has pulled millions of people out of poverty and made them middle class. China has never been more rich and advanced as they are now. The older generations remember how poor they were and are grateful of the CCP. After all, who needs freedom when you have an empty stomach? The younger generations, born in the 70s and after that, are much more critical of the government and the society. But on a cultural level, hierarchy is normal. Children aren't supposed to talk back to parents, students aren't supposed to talk back to teachers, and employees aren't supposed to talk back to their bosses, and the people aren't supposed to talk back to their government. This Confucian thinking has been embedded for thousands of years and cannot be changed that easily. This is something that the Western media and people often don't understand. In my personal opinion, a democracy won't make China better or more prosperous, like at India, for instance. A strong authoritarian government is needed because they have long-term plans for the country. In a democracy, the direction of leadership changes every few years, so it's not possible to have a long-term view. When chosen, a party must make changes immediately so people will choose them again, which will not always work for most of the plans. That being said, I do wish and hope for more transparency within the government, more respect for human rights and freedom of speech. And I do think that the Western media is hypocritical and biased towards China. Since the democracy and the prosperity of the Western countries are built on war, colonies, and by not respecting human rights in other countries, at the time, in their opinion, they were allowed to do so since other countries were poor, backwards, and were a tyranny. This kind of Eurocentric thinking is still allowed in this modern day age and to dictate that other countries should do as they say. Story 13. I'm a Taiwanese Canadian, but since Taiwan is technically the Republic of China, I grew up in Taiwan in the late 80s and early 90s. Elections were happening, and I remember these KMT, Nationalist Party, who fled China after the Chinese Civil War, representatives coming to our school. They told us to convince our parents to vote for them and gave out these pins with penguins wearing the KMT symbol on them. As a young, impressionable kid, this bribe pretty much got me to do their bidding. I remember growing up saying things like, the KMT is the true party of Taiwan since they were the original party. My grandma, heavily against the KMT, told me I was brainwashed, but as a kid, brainwashing is being strapped to a chair and forced to watch spirals, which didn't happen to me, so I dismissed her claims. When I first moved to Canada, I had more to worry about than Taiwanese politics, so all of this got pushed to the back of my mind. It wasn't until university when I started to re-examine my cultural identity that I read up on Taiwanese history and discovered that Taiwan was very different from what I saw. The KMT committed numerous atrocities ever since they received the island from the Japanese after World War II. People who were in Taiwan during the Japanese occupation were oppressed, while the KMT tried to maintain power on the island. Intellectuals and anyone else who could form a government were arrested and never seen again on the pretense that they were communist spies. Eventually, tensions soared and ended badly in the 228 incident, something I refer to as a mini version of Tiananmen Square. After that, the KMT established martial law and ruled the island with an iron fist for about 4 decades. The elections during my childhood were the first elections the island had seen. My grandmother was right. I was brainwashed. The KMT got to me early, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to leave Taiwan early. Who knows how the KMT would have shaped my mind had I stayed. Side note, I find it ironic that I'm posting this on the anniversary of the establishment of the Republic of China. Happy birthday, ROC. Story 14. Born Beijing but immigrated to the States during my teenage years. Hell, I even went to a super red, closely tied with CCP Mao school and grew up in a military district. I did not know a lot of things for sure, but I personally associate a lot of it with young age. When I moved to the States, I already knew people outside of China don't believe Taiwan was part of China, so I censored myself from ever having to speak on these occasions. I tried to befriend similar Asian immigrants here in the States, but found certain Asians would refrain from speaking to me. The Mongolians and Taiwanese were notable amongst the groups that openly dislike us. Uyghur immigrants were a surprise to me because I thought we were from the same country, therefore friends. But that wasn't the case. Uyghur immigrants would refer to Chinese immigrants as Han pigs behind our backs. I remember being shocked at first because there were Muslim children from my school in China, and we all got along fine with each other. Ethnicity was something that rarely gets brought up socially in China. The recent HK news about that have been partly censored. I found news to be censored here in the States too because I noticed the video footage of the protest being cropped differently. The Chinese usually show the cropped first part where protesters harm civilians, and the Americans show the second half where police arrive and make arrests. Xi ending his term limit was censored in China, though everyone refers to him as Emperor, long live now, to avoid characters' sensitivity for censorship. There's different animals we associate with each prime minister, and unless you were Chinese, you'd think we were talking about animals, lol. Various protests in Wuhan and Guangzhou were censored. The West didn't pick up on these, but footage was leaked on the Chinese forums. China is referred to as a motherland for most Chinese immigrants. They will defend it if they are talking to foreigners because they will see it as offensive for outsiders to criticize their nation. The cultural mentality we are kind of raised in is that I can talk bad things about my mom, but you can't. Chinese people talk bad about China all the time, but if a foreigner wants to join in, they will be like, get stuffed. This is the hidden social fabric that triggers our defensive mechanism for other things like a sports team, a university, a city, etc. Story 15. Not a Chinese immigrant, but a European that grew up in China due to my dad's career. I lived in China from 1999 to 2009, from age 7 to 17. Most surprising to me was how people view China. We knew the government was authoritarian and that censorship was a thing, but living there, it just seemed normal and not that big of a deal as it didn't affect our daily lives. Moving back to Europe, I was surprised just how much news and media attention there was directed towards the authoritarian part of China and all the human rights violations and sketchy stuff that the government gets up to. You never really hear about that stuff living there. For example, in my high school, I recall there being an urban legend that harvesting was a thing secretly done by the government, but it was a conspiracy theory that wasn't too different from discussing aliens in Area 51 in the US. Didn't really realize there was any evidence for that until after moving to Europe. Chinese people are very patriotic and proud of their country, so most surprising was to hear how much bad things and alarming news is shared about China outside of China. Story 16. I'm a Chinese student studying in the US. I was and still is a fan of politics and some of my older acquaintances working in the government, so I had motivation and chance to probe more within China than my peers. Though pretty sure there are lots of my Chinese political savvy fellows knowing more than me, all the schools I was in are prestigious ones in China. What I knew before coming to the States, the Great Leap Forward, taught in middle and high school and depicted as a wrong and uncontrolled government social test. The Cultural Revolution, taught in middle school and high school but depicted as Mao Zedong being deceived by others and mistakenly started the Cultural Revolution, though I know it's a byproduct of the power struggle within the party between Mao Zedong versus Liao Shouqi. 3 anti and 5 anti campaigns, etc., taught in middle and high school but covered little. Falun Gong suppression. All Chinese know FLG, but some may hold a different opinion. The Tiananmen protests, censored within China. Some of us know it, but some may hold a different opinion. I knew of it when in middle school, grade 2, but my view changed several times from support to against to support now. some other details about the scandal and power struggle within the party, etc. What I didn't know until coming to the States, IP violation and Chinese spy narrative. I'm still not that sure the extent of IP violation and spying from China, i.e., even if there exists such a thing, whether it's a pure ill but natural IP domestic environment or deliberate government led activity, whether it's a natural prosecution from the American administration or an excuse for an upper hand in the Sino US trade war negotiation, just as what happened during the Japanese US trade war in the last century. But these Western narratives and evidences allow me to understand the American anger towards Chinese government and companies instead of being manipulated by the one-sided nationalism propaganda. I can bet, though, that such stories would not be told within the Great Firewall, and all the Chinese citizens know is just the never-ending merchandise attacks from the US to maintain its evil hegemony. The West is not hostile to Chinese people. China was stuck in an anachronous worldview rooted from the century of humiliation from 1840 to 1945, from the War to the end of the Sino-Japanese War, enforced by thousands of years of the Great Unification tradition, and manipulated by the government. We dismiss the fact that the West turns from imperialism to liberalism. That's why some Chinese hate the Western impugns on Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong for human rights and freedom, because lots of them think it's just a hypocritical excuse for the West to play divide and conquer game on China again, just like 1 century ago. Also, though Chinese people know the difference between country and regime, they sometimes don't buy the Western reports on the CCP because they're afraid of ending up in chaos like the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, and so on, under the euphemism of fighting for freedom and democracy. The countries I listed above are the counterexamples of democracy and freedom used by CCP to persuade the people to resist the Western ideology. It's hard for Chinese people to distinguish the attack between the regime, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, the United States bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, the high-tech embargo on China, just a lot, too much even, and towards civilization. I used to hate the West because I'm also a guy suffering from these propagandas, but after coming to the States, staying on this land and communicating with some Westerners, I can more and more understand the mindset and feeling from the West. Surprisingly, after imbibing the different ideologies, you will have an exactly different view on the facts you have known before. For example, I knew the Western impugns on China's movement on Xinjiang and thought it's an epitome of Western soft power hegemony, but now I felt sad for the inhuman treatment of the Uyghurs. Although I still support some traditional Chinese opinions, such as the country's unification, I begin to bring these thoughts and explain the Western view to my Chinese friends to alleviate their blind and insane nationalism. Story 17. Personally, I knew pretty much everything long before I came here. I haven't immigrated yet, not sure if I would. I know for a fact that that doesn't apply to everybody since I've definitely met people who are more sheltered from certain information. For me and my circle of friends from the coastal cities, there was hardly anything new beyond the censorship. I think there are a few things worth noting in regards to this question and how highly people tend to think of the effectiveness of censorship. In regards to the Tiananmen Square incident in particular, which I would assume a lot of you think is censored to an extent that no one knows about it, do remember that most activists who took part in the movement back then are still very much alive and they aren't even old. It's simply impossible to wipe an event completely from existence when so many people who were at the heart of that very event are still in their prime. For the other potentially sensitive histories, the Cultural Revolution is taught in history classes and you're supposed to know about it. You get the sense that the CCP begrudgingly acknowledges that it was an era of political turmoil in their narrative. The Great Leap Forward is presented as a quote-unquote mistake. The implication is, of course, that forgiveness is warranted for Mao's misjudgment, but it was nonetheless not described as a brilliant decision by any means. The famine was blamed on natural disasters alone, and schools rarely cover party decisions that probably also played a role in causing mass starvation. It's actually pretty easy to get past censorship. A VPN isn't really rocket science. A curious teenager looking for rebellious excitement could probably get one installed. I would argue that the language barrier is a much greater hindrance, that and a general lack of initiative. I'm convinced that the fundamental problem is not whether people have access to certain knowledge as much as it is concerning people not knowing what to do with that knowledge. Up until recently, people have been able to lead relatively fulfilling lives without complete freedom of speech. Even if they haven't, there's also the factor that a collective identity is very important for a lot of people. And it's not something you give up until you find an alternative. It's easy to point fingers at other societies from the comforts of your couch, and less so when you are against your own. For Chinese people abroad who find their government's actions problematic, to protest or take any action would mean risking the safety of friends and family back home, ruining friendships with people who are more on the patriotic side but are otherwise nice people. There's also the factor of not knowing what your friends believe if none of them talks about politics, and isolating themselves from their culture while not having another culture to assimilate into. All of that for what though? Just so you can be antagonized on both sides? You wouldn't trust the West to back you up or accept you just because you stood up to your own government. Not when a lot of Western people will take a look at you and automatically assume from your complexion that you are loyal to your country. Some of them just straight up hate anything foreign, and a Chinese would know everything about that very mentality. Many people are simply not determined or idealistic enough to risk being alone and deserted, and I don't think it's fair to demand that they be. Story 18. Born and raised in China, I immigrated to Canada when I was 25. Unlike most in this sub, I never cared too much about politics, and as such, and generally consider myself to be pretty indifferent when it comes to typical brainwashed Chinese patriotism, because nobody tried to, and I'm pretty sure I'm not brainwashed, nor am I overly fascinated by the allegedly quote-unquote democratic Western society. When I was preparing for China, I was still in a time when Chinese people generally thought the grass is greener on the other side. A lot of people believe the grass is so much greener so firmly that they become spiritual Americans in a way. Just so you understand the mentality I might have taken some effect from, though like I said above, I'm pretty doubtful when it comes to the government's lies no matter the country. Let me make one other thing clear, the CCP doesn't really care too much about what a regular Chinese person would say on the internet, really. As long as you are not being crazy, waving free Xinjiang signs or some stupid stuff, nobody cares to take action on you. Well, the capital city might sometimes be a bit different though. But back to my answer, when I came to Canada and got to use Reddit more and to talk with people or just even when watching TV, I can't say I wasn't surprised by the ignorance from the Westerners. No, ignorance is not being stupid, ignorance as in how easily people buy into their government stuff and take it so seriously that America is good and China is bad is the only thing that's correct. Now, don't get me wrong, I get why some people, a majority of them I saw are Americans, are so mad at China. Xi the Pooh, a dictatorship government, menacingly centralized, and it's doing a lot of things Western people can't understand or try to, and now it's taking a leap economically, leading to its gain power when it comes to international affairs. No, a regular American Joe on the street won't even think this way. A regular American Joe would just hate China so much only because of countless deeply biased articles and videos and TV programs being pushed into them. The way bias works really truly refreshed my understanding of the Chinese government's capability of creating conspiracy. The West doesn't really use propaganda just because they don't have to. They use moral directions, double standards, and manifested media to affect people. And it's just as effective as China's notorious political propaganda, if not better. For one, the quote-unquote pro-Hong Kong movement on Reddit right now. Reddit as a whole shows me how double standardized the West truly is. I can't even remember how many times I read Free Hong Kong in any given thread with China mentioned. Like, come on, Hong Kong was returned to China, by definition, freed from British colonization in the year 1997, 22 years ago. And when people say the Chinese government bans posting stuff like Free HK or Free Tibet, I can't help but think, what would the American government would probably do if any given American starts posting about freeing Florida or Texas? Of course, Americans might not be prohibited or punished for saying stuff like this because, again, of course, freedom of speech, right? Their not even attempted crime might just end up being turned in by Facebook and shoosh, there you go, treason. IDK, how else would this kind of behavior end up with? And this is totally America right, China wrong, double standardized moment for me. Last, I hate Falun Gong. One of my acquaintances, I personally knew this person, was persuaded to emulate for the cult by harming themselves in front of Tiananmen Square by New Year's Eve. Said acquaintance didn't pass away. There are many, many more backstories like this one. And it's the ignorance that grants some Western people what to believe. It disgusts me. Story 19. I left China when I was 4 and haven't lived there since then, up until recently when I moved to Shenzhen late last year. I made the decision to move to China recently based on the increase in anti China sentiment fueled by the Trump campaign. Having grown up in Los Angeles and then being educated and employed by some of the top institutions in the San Francisco Bay Area, I gotta admit, I've been pretty lucky. I've enjoyed the luxuries that come with being in the top fifth percentile of income earners in America. But the amount of hate I see on Reddit and other news media towards my country is, in my humble opinion, completely over the top and doesn't really represent what I feel as an ethnic Chinese American individual. Every day it's Trump this and China that. I always find contradictory evidence to the mainstream anti China sentiment I consume in the West during my frequent visits to my hometown and while visiting my family in cities like Shenzhen. My family are pretty well off here, so my experience is atypical when compared to the average Chinese family, but I am finding that a lot of the Reddit hate is unfounded. For example, I keep hearing how Winnie the Pooh is banned in China, but I keep seeing stuffed animals, phone cases, and even streaming episodes of the original animated series here in Shenzhen. It seems like a lot of people I talk to already know about what took place in Beijing during the 1989 protests, as well as in subsequent Taiwan and HK protests, but they're too busy driving their Ferraris and Lamborghinis to care about it. I guess my circles operate in the upper echelons of the business community, and Shenzhen itself is an anomaly when it comes to Chinese cities, with many forward-thinking Chinese having been educated in the States or in the UK, returning to found companies here. The truth here is, at least from my perspective, that the Chinese are very well aware of the happenings in the world, but care very little about it on a day-to-day basis on account of the mountains of money they're making. The situation in Hong Kong is kind of sad right now, but only because I know there isn't much that can be done for the sake of helping the Hong Kongers out there. As much as I hate to keep telling people this, Hong Kong is still under Chinese rule and there isn't much the residents can do about it besides put up with it or leave. They have no standing army to challenge the Chinese, so fighting is completely out of the question. I doubt any other country is going to step in and do anything about it either, so tough luck, I guess? And I know this is an unpopular opinion here, so let the downvotes come down on me like a ton of bricks. At least I don't kid myself on what's actually happening around the world. And hey, if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hanging tough with me on this one.